I'm Scarlett Wirt. I'm the program coordinator for the National Railway Historical Society's Washington chapter. Our mission is to expand the public appreciation of railroads and their history through preservation and education. So if you're a longtime chapter member, you may recognize a lot of these activities that we have. Many people are familiar with the Dover Harbor, our 1923 Pullman car. We also sponsor Rail Camp, high school people to go to Rail Camp that Amtrak hosts every year. We have a railroad library in Bowie, Maryland, and we have two passenger cars, the Collinsville Inn and the Franklin Inn, that we have also restored and preserved. So we've got a lot of things going on. You also may get our timetable newsletter, monthly newsletter. But one of the main ways that we get our message out is through free public programs, and that is why we're here tonight. Our speaker tonight is John Eldridge. John is the president of the NRHS DC chapter. He's also a former naval officer, a longtime submarine commander, and a lifetime rail fan. With this background, John is uniquely qualified to present tonight's program, The Railway Gun's Last 60 Miles. Now, if you've ever walked along the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail by the Navy Yard or visited the Navy Museum there, you may have noticed the railway gun on display. It's kind of hard to miss. But did you ever wonder what it was, where it came from, or how it got there? Tonight, John will answer all those questions. He's done a tremendous amount of research, and he's become quite the expert on the railway gun and its history. So this is a unique opportunity to grill him about this piece of equipment. So our program tonight is in two parts. Part one covers the railway gun's history, its purpose, construction, and use. Part two covers the railway gun's post-World War II history, to include its journey to Dahlgren and eventually to the Navy Yard. So please join me in welcoming John Eldridge.
Thank you, Scarlett, for those kind words, and I trust that that introduction will not be the best part of the presentation. For those of you that may think I'm pulling a bait and switch by talking about the last 60 miles and advertising that and then telling you all about the history, I think you'll find it all very interesting. The two parts will go over the history, part of what some of you may have read in the timetable, how I got into this, characteristics of the gun and how it was employed. I like used bookstores, and this was probably 5 or 6 years ago. I was at a used bookstore, and they had 4 pamphlets related to railways by the Railroad Educational Bureau. So I picked up the first one, and if you can read at the bottom right, it says supervision, personal consideration. So I looked at that, and the author had a very good list of characteristics that you would want in an individual in any kind of endeavor, whether it be industry, engineering, leadership, if it was in teaching, all good characteristics. I said, well, I'll pick this up and take it. Eventually, I started writing articles for the timetable, and then when it came time, I said, well, I'll write about this guy that wrote these characteristics. His name is Buell, D.C. Buell, and it was copyrighted in 1935. I thought, hey, here it is 70 years later, and his ideas are still just as effective. Reading more about Buell, I went to the site for the New England Railroad Club, and it had a presentation Buell had given in 1919, and he talked about the railway gun. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, a railway man talking about a railway gun. And then I realized he was in the Navy as a lieutenant commander at that time. So that got me very interested in how the Navy got connected up with the railroad in this fashion. His supervisor was Rear Admiral Plunkett, and in articles that Plunkett wrote about this event, he said he was a fine railroad man. Buell happened to be in D.C. when he heard about this and mentioned, hey, I'd like to become part of it, and he supervised the inspections done at Baldwin during the construction of the guns, and he headed up the assembly once they were moved to France. However, he wasn't the most adept naval officer because Rear Admiral Plunkett was bringing General Pershing to show him the railway gun, and Buell had his back to these two, didn't know anything about it, and here comes Plunkett, and Buell's smoking a cigar. So Plunkett kicked Buell in the back of the leg, and Buell turned around, and he kind of said, get rid of that cigar. So Buell got rid of the cigar, and then Plunkett introduced Buell to General Pershing. He did go in the cab with the first gun that left. The two trains went together. If you look at this picture, Buell is in the back row, second from the left. And it's labeled, and there's a photograph where I got this, describes all of these individuals by name. If you notice, it says USN, United States Navy, on the side of that gun. And on this particular gun, just below the S, you'll see the number 145. They initially built 5 guns, and they were numbered 141 through 145. But our gun is number 148, so it was in the second group of guns that were built. We'll get more to that further in the presentation. This book is typical of the Navy. After they get done with some project, they'll put together a booklet to tell about the technical decisions that were made, how it was employed, and the history, just in a booklet form. This is available on the internet, and it's very thorough. And it's called Publication 6, and if you go by the title, United States Naval Railway Batteries, you should be able to look it up. And we'll have a link to it when the presentation is completed and put on our website. I got an awful lot of good information from this booklet. How this got started, the Germans were bombing the British front, and they had railway guns, and they were shooting long distances, and the British didn't have anything to go back at them. So Britain came to the United States, and they went and said, we need these guns. So Admiral Sims, he was a 4-star admiral, said that the British command asked the Army for these guns, and the Army said, we can't do it. Upon hearing that, the Navy Bureau of Ordnance, and that's the organization back at that time that handled all weapon systems for the whole Navy, said, we'll build the guns in 9 months. That offer was immediately accepted. In December 1917, the Navy Gun Factory, which was the Navy Yard, that's where they built guns and barrels, had 14-inch guns available that they were putting on battleships. And so they decided this would be the caliber of the gun that they would use. Now, 14 inches means the diameter of the bullet is 14 inches across. So if you picture something about that big around, that's what they're going to shoot. And this round was about 4 feet long. 50 caliber means that's the barrel length given in the term caliber. So to get the length, you multiply 14 inches by 50 caliber, and you get a 700-inch barrel, which is about 60 feet long. And as it says, the barrel weighed 96 tons. So you got a big gun. So who builds stuff for the Navy? Well, the American Industrial Base. And if you've heard of Mr. Samuel Valclane, a big name in Baldwin Locomotive Works, he was also on the munitions board. He was in a meeting, and he said, Baldwin will build these gun cars in 120 days. Pretty bold step, but Valclane was not a man to waste any time. The exact words in the reference that I got, Mr. Hansen of Standard Steel Car was so stirred by Mr. Valclane's enthusiasm and patriotism, he said, we'll build all the rest of the cars in the same period of time. So here you go in 4 months, and they're going to put together these railway guns and the railway trains. And Buell later on said Valclane would build anything. He was very capable and very proud of what his industrial base could do there at Baldwin Locomotive Works. Baldwin was at Eddystone, Pennsylvania at that particular time. They had moved from downtown Philadelphia, and Eddystone is located right along Interstate 95, south of Philadelphia International Airport. So they were contracted, they were going to build 5 gun cars and 6 locomotives. Standard Steel Car in Butler, Pennsylvania, which is north of Pittsburgh, built 72 auxiliary cars. And historical purposes, Standard eventually became part of Pullman. Car length, 84 feet, and it was going to weigh 260 tons. The barrel was going to extend 9 additional feet beyond the length of the car. By comparison, Dover Harbor is 3 feet shorter and weighs 1/3 as much. Total of about 14 cars per train, and they built 5 complete trains. There's a picture of what the whole train assembled looks like, and there's still some cars running off the right side of the picture there. But in typical, you need a locomotive and you need the gun car. But they had other cars that they took along with them, and the Navy wanted a train that was independent of support. So when they wanted to go somewhere, they could pack up and go and operate without any, I have a hard time not saying shore-based support, but you follow along what that means, but they would be independent. Notice over on the top right of the list, it says a battery kitchen car, and berthing cars. That's one thing I always admired about the Navy. We take our kitchen and our bedroom with us no matter where we go. This would have been inside the berthing car, and in the standard Navy fashion, you got berths that you can tip up out of the way during the day. In this particular arrangement, that looks like you could have 17 people in berths there, and in a submarine, we could put about 42 in that same space. But that's what it looked like inside one of the berthing cars. Here it shows one of the locomotives, and that shows the completed railway gun car. Our typical group and our car at the Navy Yard will have this same form, and you can recognize it because it has 4 trucks and there are 3 axles per truck. We'll just see other pictures of it in a few minutes. They wanted a long-range gun, and up to about 15-degree elevation, you could shoot at 12 miles. 43 degrees was about the highest it could go, and it could shoot around 23 miles. However, they never used the lower elevations in combat, because you build a long-range gun, you're going to shoot it at long ranges. No surprise at that. Some specifics of the gun: 14 inches, 50 feet long. The projectile weighed 1,440 pounds, and it took about 500 pounds of powder to shoot it that far. Inside the projectile, there'd be 100 pounds of high explosive. I could not find anything specific that said what blew up the high explosive in the round, but I imagine that it was when it hit, it would blow up. It would shoot 23 miles, and it was accurate all the way out to there. They could crank out a shot about every 6 minutes. And at the end point, 30-foot crater, 10 feet deep. And in one instance, they evaluated it. The round hit the ground, and then the fuse part of it went another 3 miles. This was the biggest gun that we employed there, and it's the biggest one ever done on mobile shore mounts. In other words, movable. Pictures inside Baldwin Locomotive Works, and you can see at the front the 4 trucks with 3 axles each lined up there, ready to go. This is the main girder has been set down onto the trucks, and the barrel is getting ready to go into place. They built an armor shield to go around it, and that's made out of 1/4-inch steel, and this shows the shield in place, and you can see the gun extended at the far left in the picture. And looking at the gun from the business end, still at Baldwin Locomotive Works. This is the only picture I have from Butler, Pennsylvania, of a standard steel car company, but this is the roof of one of the ammunition cars inside their facility. Here's the completed gun. You see, for some reason, the Navy likes white wall tires, so that seems to stand out. You can see the braking mechanism. At the left of the car, above the truck, is a winch, and that was the winch they were going to use after they shot the gun at low elevation and it rolled back. They would use that winch to bring it back up into the firing position. Notice that wheel right at the base of the gun where it goes inside the enclosure. That is used to raise and lower the barrel, and it takes about 3 turns to move the barrel 1 degree. So there was some cranking being done, and once the gun's shot, I didn't find it specifically, but it would seem like it would have to come all the way back to horizontal to reload, because you can't slide the bullet up into the gun in an angle like that. So there would be some sailors there cranking the gun all the way down, getting it reloaded, then cranking it back up to the right position for loading. Now, if you look down below the S, all the way down below the car, you can see a little bit hanging out there on the bottom. That's the back end of the gun, the breech. And when you're going to raise it up any higher than that, you have to dig a hole. And we'll get to that process next. But this gun, in order to use it at the higher elevations, went down below the level of the tracks. Good looking picture of the gun. It's probably the best one from that period of time. Once they built it, they had to go test it. So Philadelphia and Reading took it out to the Central Railroad in New Jersey, and they took it out to Highlands, New Jersey. There, a government train picked it up, took it to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. I guess it stirred up quite a bit on the way out there, because it's a noticeably large thing to see going down the tracks. So they covered it over as best they could, but you can see that's still a big piece of railway equipment. It's going to be hard to miss by people that see trains going by every day. Here's a picture of it in New Jersey. And the first shot they shot didn't go because there was a break in the electrical system, but they got that fixed. And when they shot it at low elevation, the car rolled back 26 feet. So they had figured it would go between 30 and 40 feet, but it went 26. Then they went to test it at the higher elevations, and here they would have had to dig a pit in order to get it up to shoot that high. Now, we'll get to a slide that says it later, but once the Army saw this test at Sandy Hook, the Army said, we want 3 more. And that's what got our gun into the production process. But it was after this test that they said, we'll take 3 more. To give you a summary of the dates so far and on to give you a flow of the dates, up in the top left, December, it started in 1917. In April, it was fired at Sandy Hook. All the guns were completed in the next month, and they started shipping it overseas in June. The first shipment arrived in July, but they had learned they need to wait for all the shipments to get there so they could start putting the gun together and have everything available. Assembly was completed on August 11th. So from December to August, you've got a train available to go in France. It left St. Nair's on August 17th, only going about 6 miles an hour. There was an immense amount of weight on each axle. And at that time, they used journal bearings, which is metal on metal, lubricated with plenty of oil, but they still couldn't get it going very fast because of that friction. They took it up and they shot it and employed it, and the last shot they fired was on November 11th. That was the day the armistice went into effect, and the total number of bullets shot by all 5 guns was 782. But from design to employment to being finished with the job was very quick, and a good acquisition process that the industrial base supported to help fight that war. Buell was very pleased that he was able to be involved in all that, and that's a quote from one of his statements. He went up to Great Lakes, Illinois, where the training center is for Navy recruits, and he went through the recruits, found 200 railwaymen that had experience from that crew, and brought them and started them as the core of his railroad team. He needed others, about 250 more, and he got those from other places, but 20,000 people volunteered. And I think there are 3 reasons that these people would all volunteer. Number 1, they like trains. Number 2, they couldn't swim. Or 3, they were very scared of becoming seasick. But anyway, they ended up with a good crew. Some comments. Buell said they had the best locomotives over there. I'll list there a little bit of the cars, and there's a longer picture of the train at the bottom. Down there, the second bullet from the bottom, I thought it was interesting that Buell said in the officers' headquarters car, they used it for their records and to figure out their work. Now, I don't know if that's an expression they used back then, but when I was in the Navy, most of the officers had their work figured out. They just had a hard time getting it done, but choice of words are right there. And he said it was always interesting to pull up by the little French boxcars. So these were big pieces of equipment compared to what was typically used over there. How the cars went, they went from Baldwin, they went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, then they went to this place in St. Nair's, France. There they were employed at different places, and I won't go into the French pronunciations. I can get that one for done. I can say that one pretty well. And gun 148, which is our gun, was being assembled in France at St. Nair's when the war ended, so it never was able to be employed. Here it is coming off the ship in France. That's the girder part. Girder getting ready to be assembled onto the trucks. I think that coupler, if you can notice the coupler, it must have been some coupler system that they used in Europe, but it doesn't look like the standard American coupler that we see today. Here's the barrel coming down because it's not going to do any shooting without the barrel. The barrel going in to be installed. There it is, pretty much completely assembled. Then apparently they took it inside to do some of the finishing work at the breech end of the gun. The breech is where you load it, and the muzzle's where the bullet comes out. And you can see 2 of the locomotives being worked in the background. So they had a big facility there at St. Nair's that they must have prepped real well to get ready to get these guns out and about. Here's the completed train, and it's the best one I have of this over in France. You can see the engine. The rail car, if you look at the building in the center of the picture, the rail car is just below the left edge of that building, and the gun's pointed towards the locomotive. And the train continues around behind the trees where you have the rest of the train available. But this is ready to go in August 1918. I don't think they used Google for their maps back then, but this is the general route to where they took the first gun for employment. The target was at this place called Laon, L-A-O-N. Here's going across one of the French trestle bridges. Okay, when you get ready to shoot this gun, you take it and you build a siding. And you build that siding aimed at the direction that you want it to go. Now, if you put the siding has a nice curve to it, then you can roll it back and forth on that curve to get it lined up close to where you want it to shoot. But then, like we said, it had a 26-foot recoil back along that siding. Then you'd crank it back up into the right spot on the track and aim the right direction and let it go. If they were going to use it at higher elevations, they fixed the gun in place. And once it was fixed in place, they could train it, and that means move it left or right about 2.5 degrees. They had some other subtle ways they could move it a little farther than that, but they would want this siding built close to the direction you wanted the bullet to go. But you think 2.5 degrees isn't very much, but at 20 miles, 2.5 degrees will get you 1 mile either side of your target. So there is some good flexibility. So a 44-inch recoil, though, at the higher elevations, that's how far back the gun's going to travel when it shoots the bullet. So you need a pit. And here's the pit. Top view, you can see the rail tracks, the rails come up, and then the pit is built right underneath the rails. And the side view shows how the angle of the pit is, and that gun would be shooting out to the right. So now you got this hole in the ground, and you need to reinforce it. So the cars would carry timber, and they would line the pit with timbers, and then they would have steel or iron braces that would go inside. We'll see some pictures of those in the next slide, but not yet. At the two ends of the lower picture, you see those little tripods, and those are jacks. There are 2 at each end, and each jack can handle 100 tons. They would set the car in place, raise it up on these jacks to get it off of the trucks by 4 inches. Now, that's the dimension, they said, and I think that's probably to keep the trucks from feeling the full pressure of the gun as it's shot and putting a lot of load onto the trucks themselves. But apparently, it does look like underneath the jacks, they've reinforced that very strong so that that will take the brunt force of the gun during the actual firing. This is one of the side pieces that would go in the side of the pit. These are the side pieces, the side piece on the left and the bottom of it as it's being prepared to go into the pit. But you can see what a structure it is to support the weight of the rail car and the rails as the railway gun would roll across the open pit. This would be providing the support. At the back of the pit, where the back of the gun, it would not hit this, but this was the support that went at the back, the transom bed plate. And you can see it being lowered into place in the next slide. There it is going down to help support the pit. And once the pit's all done, you can roll the train car up, put it on the jacks, and you're just about ready to go. So to summarize this process, establish the siding, dig the pit, reinforce it with steel on top of timbers, and you need some manpower to do that. So the Navy thought they could ask the Army to provide a pit crew. So they asked the Army, and here's what the Army sent. Now, we can't really fault the Army because you tell them you want a pit crew, and this is the Army pit crew, but it just didn't get the point across in the right fashion. Now, don't get me wrong, Army guys are great, and these guys are very good. But from what I understand, they only last about 35 seconds before they need to go on a coffee break, and it takes about 16 hours to repair a pit. So the Navy went in a different direction. But thank you for that pit crew picture. By the time the guns were ready, they didn't need them at the British front. And Pershing said, that's okay, send them all to me in France. They proved to be very effective, and at the town of Laon, one projectile did hit a moving supply train, and that was just by luck. I mean, they were shooting at the area where the railways were, but it just happened to hit that one train at one time. It did some damage too. This is Franklin Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of Defense visiting the railway gun in August of 1918. And I think this is just before it was ready to go. But there's Roosevelt, and little did we know he was going to be the president then, and that's Plunkett, Admiral Plunkett, standing beside him. Another picture of Roosevelt and Admiral Plunkett. Picture so you can get some idea of the size of the bullets. And this is a picture loading the ammunition car, and they carried 2 ammunition cars on each train, and each ammunition car would hold about 25 bullets. And this is loading to get the bullets into the ammunition car. Now the picture on the top right gives some idea of how the gun got loaded. This is the ammunition car, and it would back up all the way to the back of the railway gun, and an I-beam would come out and form a trolley, and they had a pulley assembly and a trolley that would ride down that I-beam and take the bullet from the ammunition car. It would roll downhill to the gun and be stopped by some hydraulic rams that would stop it before it reached the breech. Then they could put it and move it into the breech, put in 500 pounds of powder behind it, and they'd be all ready to shoot it. So they build a siding, a pit, and then you got to aim it. And this gets a little bit interesting and probably a little technical. You need a map, and lots of maps are developed in different ways, but the one we most commonly see on the wall of our schoolrooms was called a Mercator projection. And now the Mercator projection, all the latitude and longitude lines are parallel to each other. And if you look at a Mercator projection and you look at Washington, D.C., if you go due east, you'll get to Lisbon, Portugal. They are on the same latitude. And you can get in your boat and you can put your compass on due east and drive and you'll get there. But it's not the shortest distance. It's not the way an airplane would go. It's not the way a bird would fly, and it's not the way a bullet would go. So you need to take into account the different way a map is drawn. Now, if you go to one called a Lambert projection, which is designed a little bit differently, and if you looked at a Lambert projection, it would look distorted somewhat from the shape we commonly see the states and the continents in, but it would be much better in showing which direction to shoot a cannonball to get it go where you want. So they had to get the French to come up with some Lambert projections. And another thing that's interesting and required for a Lambert projection to do you the most good, it has to be designed around the area you want to use it. Because if you design it in one area and you go 1,000 miles away, it's not going to be as good as if it was designed at that other spot. Another thing they had to take into account was that the Earth rotates, and in certain trajectories of a bullet, the Earth's rotation can cause it to go 200 feet to the right. And why I say to the right is everything in the Northern Hemisphere turns to the right. Southern Hemisphere turns to the left. So that's the way it goes. This round could spend up to 90 seconds in the air. So there's some time in flight that's involved. Here are some things that you really need to take into account to make the gun accurate. Orientation, you need to know which way north is. So what they would do is get some object, and they sometimes would frequently use a stake and pound the stake in the ground and determine from the gun what direction that stake actually is. And they can't use a map to do that. They would use a theodolite, which is like one of those surveyor's instruments, and they would observe the sun, and using the same technique they use for navigation, they could determine what accurate direction that is, and that would allow them to determine which way the gun was actually pointing. The bore sighting, they would have to make sure that the bore center line was a certain number of degrees away from the anchor point where they put the stake in the ground. So they would make sure that that lined up so that they knew which way, left and right, the bore was going. Barometer was mainly used to measure a difference in pressure between the gun and the target. And they would convert those slight differences in pressure into differences in height. Because if the bullet's going to land at a different height than what it took off from, that needs to be taken into account. Velocity loss. The more rounds you put down a barrel, the hotter it gets, and it starts losing velocity. The Navy's all over that because they've been shooting bullets down barrels for many, many years, and they knew how to handle that very carefully. The other velocity loss is the powder. As it gets cold, it starts losing velocity, and it was mentioned in the references, at times they would use steam to heat the powder up to keep it at the right temperature so they get the right muzzle velocity coming out. Trunnion tilt is once you put the gun on the jacks, every shot, you'd have to check and make sure that that hasn't affected the tilt of it at all. They wanted to know the wind, and they would fly a balloon up and just watch how it went and determine the direction and the speed. Now, that's okay in the daytime. At night, or if it was bad weather where they couldn't see the balloon, things were different. So what they would do is they'd get balloons and they'd put charges on them that would explode a certain period of time after the balloon was launched. And at night, they would listen and tell what direction it was. And if they had one set up to go a certain time and they knew how fast the balloon went up, they would be able to determine the wind velocity up in the air aloft. So all that goes into helping making it accurate. The barrel has some grooves inside it that cause the bullet to spin. And these bullets would spin to the right, and that would cause it to drift to the right. Now, this is not the same drifting to the right that it does because the earth turns. This is additional drifting to the right because the bullet's spinning. And then you have the aiming point. How good is the map of the target? So how do you solve all these things very easily? Well, use a spotter. They get an airplane and they go up, I think, about 12,000 feet, have it flying around over the target, and the first bullet comes in and the guy says, hey, go 100 yards to the right and 200 yards downrange and shoot for effect. Well, that's what they do basically in naval gunfire at sea. But in this case, they were only able to use a spotter about 10% of the time. So let me talk a little bit more about what they did without a spotter. They would know where the target is, and they would usually they'd want to put about 20 rounds down at the target. So since they didn't have any feedback from the hits of the first couple of bullets to correct it for, they'd shoot a pattern. And they would start out, and sometimes they'd use an X or something else, but they'd start like at the top left and shoot around. And then the next one they'd shoot 50 yards shorter and 50 yards to the right and go 50 yards or 50 yards and on until they shot 10 rounds. And then they'd go to the top right corner of the X and start shooting down the other way. And this proved to be pretty effective for those times when they didn't have a spotter. So here it looks like they've got the gun just about all ready to go. And there it goes. Where was the gun employed? Well, to give you an idea, this will show Paris is in the green circle, and up will come the different places where the gun shot from. Those weren't the targets because the targets are a little bit farther away. That first circle over to the right came up, and that's Verdun, and that's where they did quite a bit of the shooting. But it indicates that 8 different places were used where these guns were employed. All of those places were in France also. Now this is Lyon, and if you look at the targeting, that little circle down just to the right of center, that small circle is 7 rounds, and that's a 100-yard diameter circle. The big circle is 8 rounds, and that's 300 yards diameter of that circle. And then you look at the rounds that they put around this rail center, and you can see where they hit. And they're all pretty close for being shot, I don't know exactly, probably 20 miles away. If you notice also, there's a line going from the lower left to the upper right, and that says on the line of fire. So that's the direction back to the launch point where the railway gun was set up. And so that shows how they could train it and change the direction of it to get the target pretty well saturated with some explosives ordnance that they could not ignore in the town of Lyon. Up until the armistice, which went into effect at 11 o'clock on the morning of the 11th of November, they were shooting the last round. And they shot at 10:57, and it hit just before the armistice went into effect. And that was from battery number 4. So they took them all back to St. Nair's and brought them home. And here it's at Philadelphia Naval Yard being unloaded from the USS West Hasaki. Girder coming off. I counted about 47 people standing on the barrel of this gun. And here the gun itself is coming off of the West Hasaki. These are models, and our gun is on the top. They realized this pit was a problem, so they designed a gun that was being designed at the end of World War I that would not need a pit. And you can tell the difference easily because this one has trucks of 5 axles each. So here, instead of having 6 wheels at each end, you've got 10. And what they would do is they would put the bottom railway gun in place, and then they would raise up the girder to get it far enough off the trucks that they could have the clearance they needed to aim the gun to its highest elevation. That gun was never employed in wartime. I'm not sure where this picture was taken, but the gun was finished and built somewhere, and you can see at the back it's got in big bold letters, U.S. Navy on the back. But that's the newer railway gun. Like I mentioned, once the Army saw what it did at Sandy Hook, they said, we want 3 more. They brought them back in 1919, and I don't know where they went after that, but in 1922, the Navy wanted a gun, and they asked for a railway gun. They were turned over to the Army, and in 1922, the Navy asked to have one back so they could use it in armor testing at Dahlgren. That's how the gun got to Dahlgren. So they sent gun 148 via the Navy Yard, and I don't know why it necessarily went to the Navy Yard, but I assume that would have been by rail because the rail infrastructure would have been still in place at the Navy Yard. It's all gone today, but it was there in place at that time. And then later on in 87, it was turned over to the Naval Heritage and History Command, and it finally found its way to the Navy Yard. So in summary, for part 1, I was always impressed at the rapid acquisition that they went through, and well, wartime does things to you, but they turned to, and the fact that Baldwin and the Standard Steel Car stood right up and said, our troops need this, we're going to help you out. That's very impressive. It did have a fairly good impact of being able to fire rounds every 6 minutes, and it did damage at the site. I had wonderful resources to use from this. All of them are available, and that's a list of them right there. I think Mr. Jim Pointer is here in the audience today, and when I got a hold of him, it was like opening up a treasure chest of stuff because he on his own has gone to the Library of Congress, National Archives, and got a wealth of material that I had no chance of getting all the way through other than pulling out interesting tidbits. But he's got copies of the typed written letters from each day of the gun reporting how it was used and what happened that day. Very intricate and detailed records are available. And thank you, Jim, for putting all that together in one place and making it available to me. Okay, I have not been watching the chat. Scarlett's been watching, and I'm real good with questions. I'm just not very good with answers. But go ahead, Scarlett, if you've got anything to offer.
Back a while, or close to the beginning, we had a question from Donna Dolan. And I don't know, you may have covered this, but what was the recoil length and how far back did the guns and cars go?
Okay, the only time I know that it really let it roll back was when they tested it at low elevations at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and that was 26 feet. And then the other information indicates that the recoil of the barrel itself inside the railway car was about 44 inches.
All right, and then when you were talking about the maps, there was a question as to whether what you were explaining was the Coriolis effect.
When the Coriolis effect in the Northern Hemisphere is what causes all things to turn right. Now, you may, I don't want to bring up the weather, but a hurricane rotates to the left, but the wind is trying to go towards the center. That's where the low pressure is. So the wind is moving towards the center of the hurricane, and as it moves, it turns to the right, which gives it that counterclockwise rotation. I've always wondered if a hurricane crossed the equator, how it would change direction, but it hasn't happened yet. All right, if no other questions, Scarlett, I'm ready to continue.
Go right ahead.
All right, now, this starts out our second part of the presentation, how it did get the last 60 miles. My good friend Andy Van Syke saw this picture and said, John, can you lower the gun down a little bit and raise your portrait up a little higher? I said, well, I kind of like it the way it is. Why do you want it? And he said, well, if we do it just right, we can get the gun pointing right at your head. So Andy, that wishful thinking on your part is not going to be put into practice here. Okay, how it got to Dahlgren and how it got to the yard. Here we go. We went over just now. It went to France. War ended. It came back. Bureau of Ordnance asked the Army for the gun, and it got shipped to Dahlgren. And here's what they did with it. That's our gun sitting there. It doesn't have the armor covering over it for personnel protection. And it's aimed at the target that looks like it's about 60 feet away. And that is a piece of armor that they're testing for the further construction of ships, because this would have been before they built the Iowa class. And I don't know about the ones before that, but the Navy treaty was in effect then. So they were being very careful about what they did with building capital ships at that time. But that gun shooting at that target not so far away must have made a wicked impact. But apparently it did its job, because they put out some pretty good armor around the ships that we used in World War II. But that mounded dirt and all is probably to stop it from going farther than it would. But that's what they used it for at Dahlgren. This slide's at Dahlgren. It looks like they put it all back together and got it ready for display. Now we'll jump ahead to the 60s, and here it is at Dahlgren. I don't know, and I never got any anything that I read that indicated whether it was on display as part of a museum or just in storage and available to be viewed. But anyway, we got these pictures. And there's the business end of a 14-inch gun. Notice it looks like it's got the standard U.S. type of couple hooked onto it in this particular picture. So they decided to move it to the Navy Yard. Williams, Crane, and Rigging were the ones that got it from Dahlgren onto a barge, and they're the ones that got it from the barge onto the Navy Yard. I tried to contact Williams, Crane, and Rigging, but I think they've changed hands or something, but it's been lost from their records, but they weren't able to provide anything. They did take it apart into 7 sections, and they loaded it on a barge. Here it's being disassembled at Dahlgren. Kenneck Marine Towing was contracted to move it and make the movement from Dahlgren up to Washington, as you can see. The barge they used, I found out it was a Jimmy Steen, and the tug was American Veteran. I couldn't figure out or find out what happened to those two particular items, but that's what they used to bring it up, and it came up on December the 11th, 1987. So it comes up the Potomac River and takes a right and then goes over to the Anacostia River to get to the Navy Yard. Here's the picture, and I'm sorry for the quality, but I was able to dig it out of a Navy Civil Engineer magazine, but it shows the tug there at the back, American Veteran, and there's the barge. And you see the gun. It apparently was all loaded in one trip, and there's the gun on its girder, and you can see the personnel protection part of it sitting down in front of the gun. And that's it, coming up towards Washington. So to get it from the barge over to the Navy Yard, they used 14-foot I-beams, and they built a track to put it on. And while they were moving the gun off of the barge, they had to adjust the flotation on the barge to keep the track level. And they used jacks. They said here 4 for lifting and 2 for movement. I don't know if you've happened to have seen the video of them moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. They had some hydraulic jacks going sideways that they would move it a few feet and then reposition it. But apparently we could get 2 feet per stroke out of the hydraulic jacks as they moved the railway gun into its final location. And I don't know who came up with that famous quote. I'm sure it was a big job. It took 120 feet to go from the barge up to its final display position. That was December 13th that it got there. The Navy Construction Battalion, Seabees, they're the ones that built the final display location. This is what it looked like in 1993, and it's nicely painted, and the gun's pointing to the left I don't know what that blue thing is coming out at the right, but I think that's some kind of display that's beyond the railway gun, but that is not part of the gun. Now, if you look at the way it's pointed, and if you live near Reston, well, from that position, that gun could shoot all the way out to Reston. The yard is different nowadays because they've planted trees on this side of the gun, which blocks its view from the water. And along the seawall there, they've built the Anacostia Riverwalk Trail. And that's open to the public. You can walk along there, and there's a fence between the walk and the yard, but you can look at the Navy Yard by walking along that public access fence. This is what it looks like today, and in the very lower left, you can see a piece of stone, and on that is a brass plaque. And that's why I first read about the gun, because I worked at the Navy Yard for several years. And right then it talks about the rapid acquisition that it went through in the short period of time between the need was identified and that it was procured and employed all. But that's the end here, and the barrel's at the other end. But this is where the ammunition car would back up against it, and then it would pass the rounds from the ammunition car into the railway gun car. So from 1922 to 87, it sat at Dahlgren. And then it moved here in 1987. It's been here ever since. All the rest of the guns were turned over to the Army to be used as shore batteries, but none of them ever got installed for that, and they were all scrapped. We've got the only gun left from that group that was employed in World War I. Great material, but that one article that was key in this is that final one mentioned from the Navy Civil Engineer magazine that had the pictures and talked about what an effort it was to move that gun up to the Navy Yard. Well, I think this is a part most of you have been waiting for. I'm done. There's a picture of both sides of the railway gun, the back end of it and the other end. And those two bullets there, I don't think those are railway gun bullets. I think those are 16-inch diameter rounds that were used in the larger battleships that we had after that. But that's on display at the Navy Yard. Somebody mentioned earlier, it's a shame that the Navy Yard is off limits, and I think all the museum stuff is off limits now because of the virus impact. But hopefully, they've been talking about it for years of getting the Navy Museum more access to the public, but I don't think that railway gun's going anywhere, so it's inside the yard. Okay, Scarlett, if any more questions have come up, I'll attempt to answer them. Otherwise, that ends my presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for joining in, and I hope it was educational, interesting, and if neither one of those, I hope it was entertaining. Thank you all for your time. And Scarlett, any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple, John. First, just a comment from Thomas Frezza. I believe he's referring to the screen that you have up now, that's an 18-inch gun from Yamato. Is that correct, Mr.
18-inch shell.
Shell, yes, okay. Great presentation. Here's a question for you. A comment on the plane behind the gun. John Cowgill says there was another gun on rails on display years ago. It appeared to have been removed and replaced with this one. And then finally, there was a slide that had 3 guns, World War I and newer, and a small one on a half track.
Yes, that was this picture.
About the gun on the half track.
I don't know anything about that gun, but those were all, that was this picture of the models. And I don't know what that half-track gun was. I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Lots of thanks and appreciation from folks for sharing your time and knowledge.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And so I want to thank you too. I saw a dry run of this, and the real thing was even better. I learned something new tonight. Really great presentation. And I thank you for all the research that went into it and the just sharing it with us tonight. I also want to thank our behind-the-scenes folks, Ann Mason and Garen Goldsmith. They are not responsible for the bad email. That's all on me. They did all the good things, all the right things. They worked perfectly. So this program will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out a link when that happens so that you can see the front part of the program if you missed it. We've also got links up to a couple of programs that we've done earlier this summer that you may be interested in if you didn't see them originally. The first is a program about Bill of Rights, now arriving Washington, Union Station, and Life in the Nation's Capital. And then we had Andy Van Syock with the new management of the East Broad Top, talking about the history of the railroad and the new owners and their plans. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I would encourage you to look at that. Okay, so that concludes our program tonight. Thank you for attending, and we hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.